If you love immersive ASMR horror stories that whisper straight into your spine, this terrifying tale from Willow's End Trailhead will pull you deep into a nightmare you'll never wake. From your listening to ASMR 404 Found, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. They told me never to step past the rusted gate at Willow's End Trailhead, that once you crossed the boundary, the woods would swallow you like a dying breath. The sun itself refused to shine in that part of southern Indiana where the trees grew. Too thick the air hung too heavy, and the silence pressed on your skull like hands that didn't belong to you, my uncle. Jackson used to say that the forest there was older than the dirt itself, and that it remembered every drop of blood spilled, born its soil, even if no one else. Dee Dee was never the type to believe in ghost stories or whispered warnings carved into decaying pine, but the job posting was too good to pass up. They needed a seasonal ranger at the old Willow's End Preserve, and the pay was double what the state usually offered. I had student debt clawing at my spine, and a lease I could barely afford, so I said yes before even reading the fine print. The interview was done over the phone. No background check, just directions. To the Ranger cabin off Route 26, with a warning to arrive before sundown. I reached the trailhead 15 minutes before dusk. The sky was a bleeding orange over the horizon, and the trees stood like waiting figures carved from shadow. The wooden sign that read Willow's End Trailhead US Forest Service restricted access was hanging by one rusted chain, and across its center was a smeared handprint, a deep red crusted stain that could have been paint, but I knew it wasn't paint. Something about the way it had dried told my body to turn back, even while my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The ranger cabin sat 2 miles down the trail, and the hike felt like wading through molasses. The silence here wasn't just quiet, it was thick, oppressive. Each footstep on the leaf-littered path sounded too loud, like I was waking something sleeping beneath the roots. I heard breathing, not mine, not animal, just long, wet inhales, like something massive dragging air through lungs older than time. I kept walking because I couldn't stop, because my body wouldn't let me stop. And when I reached the cabin, the door was already open. The lights were already on. The interior looked untouched. Since the 80s, wood panel walls faded. Posters warning about invasive species. An old radio in the corner with a note that read "Use only at midnight." The fridge was unplugged. The bed was still made with government tissue sheets, and a binder sat on the desk labeled Ranger Protocols, Willow Division. I opened it expecting maps, safety guides, but every page was blank until the final sheet, which had a message written in jagged ink stay. Inside after dark, do not follow the whispers, do not answer the knock at the door. The forest remembers. I stayed up that first night, pretending I wasn't terrified, pretending the shadows moving behind the curtains were tricks of wind, and that the scraping sound outside was just a branch. But I knew there were no branches that close. The trees were kept trimmed at least 15 feet from the structure, but something scratched along the walls. Anyway, slow, deliberate strokes, like fingers too long to belong to a man, And when the knock came, it wasn't hesitant, it wasn't polite, it was 3 heavy blows that shook the wood like a battering. Rami didn't answer. I couldn't move. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with something wet and smiling. And waiting, I fell asleep sometime before dawn, not because I felt safe, but because my body shut down from fear. I woke up to find the front door wide open, though I know. I locked it, and just inside, on the welcome mat, was a dead crow with its wings splayed, and its eyes still open, staring at me, like it knew me, like it hated May. Spent the morning hiking the trail, marking the trees, like I was told, and trying not to notice the strange symbols carved into their trunks. They weren't made by knives or tools, but by something sharper, thinner, older. They looked like veins bursting outward from a single point. Sometimes they formed mouths, sometimes eyes, sometimes twisted things with too many limbs, and I knew without knowing that they weren't just drawings. They were invitations, that 3-mile marker. I found a pile of clothes, perfectly folded jeans, flannel boots laid side by side, no ID. No blood, no signs of struggle, but beside them, in the dirt, were bare footprints, walking away. Into the brush, deeper into the woods, away from the trail. They looked fresh, like the person had just walked off the moment before I arrived. But when I called out, there was no answer, just the wind whispering things. I couldn't quite understand. That night, I used the radio just to see if it worked. The static was thick, bend wet, like breathing through cotton, and for a moment, I heard something underneath it. Not words exactly, but shapes of sound, like something speaking without language. Something ancient, something hungry. I turned the dial, and a voice cut through, so sharp it made my nose bleed. He's watching you. He knows you don't belong. Leave the crow at the tree, and it might let you guide. Didn't know what that meant, but I didn't wait to find out. I took the dead crow and carried it to the tree nearest. The cabin, the bark was pulsing like it was breathing, and when I laid the bird at its base, the ground around the roots turned black, like ink bleeding through fabric, and the air tasted like copper and rot. I ran back to the cabin and slammed the door, and this time I nailed it shut from the inside. Night got worse. The knock came earlier. The whispers moved closer. Sometimes I'd see faces outside the windows, not human faces, but parodies, things made of bark and teeth and hair, and they would mouth words I couldn't hear, but somehow still understood. They told me secrets about myself, things I'd buried, things no one should know. They told me that I was chosen not by accident, but by blood, that something in my family had started, a pact generations ago, and now it was my turn to finish E.T. Found my uncle's journal beneath the floorboards, a thin black book soaked through in places with something that smelled like meat. The pages told me the trail was never a trail. It was a gate, and the trees weren't just trees. They were watchers. The knocking wasn't asking to be let in. It was warning me something else was already inside. Something wearing my skin. Something that wanted to remember what it felt like to bleed. Night. I caught my reflection, watching me not in the mirror, but in the glass of the window. It smiled. When I didn't, it blinked out of time with me. And when I moved, it moved just a little too slow, like it was thinking about how to copy me right under The next morning I woke up outside, naked knees buried in the mud with dirt in my mouth, and something carved into my chest, not deep enough to bleed, but deep enough to stay it, said return. The trees grew thicker, the trail changed behind me. No matter how far I hiked, I ended up back at the cabin, even when I tried to leave during daylight, even when I used a compass, even when I followed the sun. Every path bent back like a noose tightening. Every mile looped like a scream, swallowing its own echo, and the forest laughed not with sound, but with feeling, with pressure, with presence. I tried burning the cabin down, the fire wouldn't catch. The wood wouldn't blacken, the flame died like it was choked high. Tried calling out, no signal, just whispers. I tried closing my eyes, but the knocking never stopped. I started marking the days on the wall with a knife. I found under the sink an old hunting blade, stained with something black and dry. There were already 38 marks before I made the first of mine, all of them scratched deep, like someone didn't want to forget, and I began to wonder how many rangers came before me, how many were offered the same pay, the same false promise of safety, the same slow death under the roots of a forest that didn't need a reason to feed. One night, the whispers changed. They started using my name, whispering it from behind the walls, from inside the mattress, from beneath the floor. They didn't call it, they tasted it, like they were savoring something familiar, something they'd missed, something veiled. I tried stuffing my ears with tissue, with cloth, with wax, but nothing kept them out, because the whispers weren't sound. They were thought, they bloomed behind the eyes, they curled beneath the tongue, they found the hollow places inside. Meme filled them with noise. I started dreaming in bark. I would wake up with splinters under my nails, sap crusted along my chest, veins bulging like roots, trying to burst free. My voice cracked when I tried to speak, and one morning I couldn't speak at all, only groan, only gasp, and when I looked in the mirror my mouth was full of dirt, packed tight like the forest was planting something inside me, watering it, feeding it, naming it in a language I wasn't meant to know. I found the first photograph tucked inside the Ranger protocols. It hadn't been there before, a faded Polaroid of a man standing in front of the cabin, his face torn off, scratched away with something sharp, and next to him was someone else, someone wearing my face. Not like a twin, not like a brother, like a mask, like a perfect copy, and its hand was on the other man's shoulder, tight, gripping, the way a hunter holds its kill before the last breath. The knocking grew constant now, not just at night, not just at the door. It came from the closet, the fireplace, the sink, the walls, and the roof, and the sound of it burrowed into my spine, each hit like thunder behind. The eyes like a reminder, like a punishment for forgetting my place here, and the whispers told me if I opened the door, it would stop. But only if I looked it in the eye, only if I gave it back what was stolen. I started seeing them in the trees, shapes not quite human, watching me as I walked the trail. Their bodies twisted, their limbs too long, too thin, too silent, their eyes wide and black and endless. And when I blinked, they moved closer, but only when I blinked, only when I looked away, and I realized they were herders, guiding me, steering me, pushing me back toward the cabin no matter how far I ran. They were always ahead of me, waiting, crouching, smiling. The map on the wall changed overnight, the trailhead, circled in red with a new path drawn in ink that smelled like iron and mold. It led past the marked boundaries into an area, labeled only with 3 symbols that didn't belong to any language. I knew, and beside the map was a note written in the same jagged hand as the rules before. It said simply, "Return the borrowed face, or lose your one." Looked in the mirror again. And this time, the reflection didn't match. It stood still while I moved. It smiled when I cried. It raised its hand before I did, and then it stepped forward without me, and I felt something tear behind my ribs, like string pulled too tight, like flesh forgetting its shape in the mirror, cracked not from impact, not from force, but from refusal, from truth, splitting in half. Like a mouth learning to scream, packed my bag, I left the cabin. I followed the new path. I didn't want to, but my legs moved on their own, like they remembered the way, like they belonged to someone else. And the forest welcomed me, not with sound, not with warmth, but with hunger. The trees leaned back. The fog parted, and the ground pulsed with wet breath as I stepped deeper into the marrow of something too big to see. All at once, the trail disappeared behind me, like it had never been there. The sky turned gray, then black, then something deeper than black. A color that couldn't exist, and my flashlight flickered in my hand until it finally died, and I was left with only the light of the trees. Yes, the trees, they glowed from within, a soft, sick green that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, and cast shadows that didn't match their shapes. Walked for hours, maybe days. I couldn't tell, because time had started bleeding around me. It bent and snapped and repeated like broken film sometimes. The same branch would break underfoot 3 times in a row. Sometimes the whisper would say the same word backward, forward, then sideways, and I began to feel language unraveling in my head, meanings slipping like water through roti. Reached the heart of the trail, a clearing that shouldn't exist, a space too large for the forest to hide, but somehow it did. In its center was a pit wide, deep, filled with fog and lined with bones, thousands of bones, picked clean and arranged in spiral patterns that hurt to look at, and at the edge of the pit stood a man, or a copy of a man, or a memory wearing my face, but older, stretched thinner, wild-eyed, smiling without teeth. He spoke with my voice, but too many layers behind it, like he was built from echoes, and inside each word was a scream that didn't get out. He told me that I was home. He told me the cabin was never meant to keep me safe. It was meant to prepare me, and that I wasn't the first me to walk this path, and I wouldn't be the last, and that the forest didn't want my body, it wanted my name. He opened his mouth, and black roots spilled out, sliding down his chest, reaching for my feet, and when they touched me, I remembered everything. I remembered my mother's whisper when I was 6, telling me never to go near the woods. I remembered the night Uncle Jackson came back from Willow's end with eyes that never blinked again. I remembered waking up in the hospital at 11 with dirt packed in my ears, and a doctor saying they found me in the forest 3 days after I'd gone missing. I never left. I was always here. The forest just let me forget. He stepped back into the pit without falling, without flinching, and the roots followed him dragging my memories with them, and the fog closed over his head, like a mouth swallowing a prayer, and I turned around, and the trail was waiting. Again, not where I left it, but where it needed me, and I walked back, numb, hollow, empty. And when I reached the cabin, the front door was gone, replaced by bark and leaves, and the windows were now eyes watching from the inside. I live here now. I mark the days I warn, the ones who come after I whisper through the trees. I am the knocking, I am the voice behind the glass. I am the reflection that smiles when you don't. Sometimes they come in groups, laughing, carrying tents and beer cans and trail mix, smiling like the woods are just a place for adventure. Like they haven't felt the eyes yet, like they don't hear the voices beneath the wind, and I watch them. From behind the trees, from the places where bark splits like lips and the moss breathes like lungs, and I wait because they always reach the cabin eventually, and when they do, they never knock. They just walk in like it's theirs, like it's empty, like it isn't already listening. I tried to warn the last group, a young woman and her brother. Hiking through from another state, I left signs. Branches bent in shapes that only the forest should understand. Symbols scrawled in charcoal and bone. But they ignored them, they laughed, they took photos and posted them online. And that night the trees moved closer, the fire they built hissed and cracked and refused to stay lit, and in the morning only the woman remained, her eyes wide, her mouth filled with feathers, her hands raw from digging in the dirt, looking for a way out that never existed. She screamed my name, not the name I was born with, the one the forest gave me, and I answered because I always answered the whisper that crawled through. Her spine wasn't mine, but it used my shape, it wore my voice, and when she turned and ran, I was already ahead of her, already smiling, already gone. And when she reached the cabin, she slammed the door and locked it, and found the knife, and made the first mark on the wall, not knowing it was already full of her own scratches, from lives she couldn't remember, from nights that never ended. The forest is a circle, a spiral, a throat swallowing over and over again, and I am its voice. Now I am its face. I no longer eat, I no longer sleep, I no longer bleed. Remember the final night before I became this. The rain fell sideways, the fog grew teeth, the trees bent backward to reveal what they hid. A shape too tall, a mouth too wide, eyes that blinked like shutters between realities. It called itself the Root King. It wore the skin of a ranger, older than time. Its ribs were antlers, its spine a chain of vertebrae, still screaming. It asked me if I was ready. It asked me if I wanted to forget it. Told me that all I had to do was breathe. All I had to do was listen. And I did. I listened. Let it in. It crawled inside me through every opening. Through mouth, through ear, through memory, and when it filled me, I didn't feel pain. I felt purpose. I became the trail. I became the air between the trees. I became the silence that follows a scream that never escapes the throat they sent. A recovery team last year, drones and search dogs and men with rifles and radios. None of them returned whole. Some were taken by the roots, some by the reflections, some simply lay down and forgot how to stand back up. One wrote a name in the mud before disappearing. his own, and beneath it the word Minai. Visit the trailhead. Now and then the sign still hangs by one rusted chain, the handprint. Now fresh, always bleeding. Sometimes cars pull up, people step out and hesitate. They feel it, even if they don't understand. Those who turn back, they survive, they never sleep well again. But they live. Those who enter, they become part of the chorus. You can hear us if you stand very still, just before dawn, at the edge of Willow's End, where the trees breathe cold, where the wind speaks without words, where the dirt shifts with memory. We will whisper your name, not the one you wear, the one you've forgotten. If you answer, if you listen, if you knock, we will open and you will never leave. Because Willow's End is not a place, it is a hunger, a memory, a mouth. It remembers you. They warned us not to follow the Jacob's Hollow Trail after the rain, said it was cursed, said it opened only when it was hungry, said the pine trees, their whispered names that didn't belong to the living. I thought it was just backwoods nonsense. A ghost story told to keep teens from getting lost in the Appalachian fog, but I wasn't a teen anymore, and I didn't scare easy, not until I stood at the edge of that hollow and felt something pull at the center of my chest, like an old string, tied to something buried. And waiting I was with my cousin Jared. He'd moved out to this part of West Virginia 2 years earlier and worked land surveys for a private conservation group, the kind that charted old trails for government buyouts. Most of the time it was boring forest mapping, but every now and then they ran into odd terrain, the kind the maps didn't like, the kind that looked different every time. You walked it, he called it phantom woods, where landmarks shifted and trees bled. Sap that smelled like iron, not pine. He told me about Jacob's Hollow around a fire one night, said his company refused to even step foot past the third marker. Said old rangers used to throw salt in a circle before entering and left carved sticks behind them like breadcrumbs, but made of bone, he said. One of the older rangers walked it back in '96, and when he returned he had carvings all over his legs, like someone had used his skin to write stories in a language no one knew. And then he walked back into the woods 3 days later, naked and smiling, and never came out. Agaya laughed when he said it, not because I thought it was funny, but because I needed to break the silence his words left behind. Jared didn't laugh, he just stared into the fire and said, "Don't follow the pines." When they leaned the next morning, we packed up gear and headed out. I had begged him to take me to that trail, and against his better judgment he finally said yes, but only if we turned back. The first lean tree I promised, but deep down I knew I wouldn't keep it. I had to see it for myself, had to feel what the old stories tried to bury. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign carved long ago and overgrown with moss. Jacob's Hollow Trail, U.S. Forest Survey, Division 1943. Someone had carved another word beneath it in faded red mourning, as if the trail had earned a new name after too many losses. The first mile was uneventful, dense forest, damp earth, squirrels and birds. Nothing out of place until we reached a patch where the pines began to grow closer. Together, unnaturally close trunks, bending toward each other like they were sharing secrets or conspiring their roots. tangled into grotesque patterns, knots that looked like clenched fists and screaming mouths. I felt the air shift, not in temperature, but in taste. It turned metallic, wet, like rusted iron water, and it clung to the back of my throat like smoke. Jared stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "Do you see it?" I nodded. The first leaning pine. It bent at a sharp angle toward the trail, its top scraping low, like it was bowing or reaching, and from its bark hung a strip of cloth, old, sun-bleached, fluttering slightly in wind that didn't touch the other trees. "We should turn back." "That's the rule," he said. I told him we'd come this far, and the look in his eyes said he knew he'd already lost the argument. We crossed beneath the leaning pine, and every step after that felt like we were being watched, not from the side, not from the trees, but from above, as if the canopy itself had eyes, as if the forest had learned to blink, and somewhere, just beyond sound, I began to hear the whispering, not words exactly, not voices either, just something that felt like breath near my ear when no one was there. The trail narrowed, the sky darkened, and the air thickened with the weight of silence that wasn't empty but listening. We reached what looked like an old marker half buried in mud, a stone obelisk covered in strange carvings. Most had been worn down by time, but one stood out, freshly etched and still wet, as if it had just been carved that morning. It was a symbol, like a tree split down the center, with one half made of bone, the other by of screaming faces, and beneath it a single word. "Turn." Jared told me this was where the other ranger turned back. I told him I wasn't ready to, and something in the trees above us shifted like leaves. Breathing in, we continued deeper, and that was when we found the first cairn, pile of stones, not unusual except it had teeth embedded between them. Human molars, still white and grinning, and around the base bones, small and long. Not animal, but not quite human either, and beside it was a boot, filled with dried blood and roots that moved slowly, curling like fingers. When we stepped near, I wanted to run, but my legs didn't listen. Something about Jacob's Hollow changes the rules of fear. It doesn't make you panic, it makes you curious. It makes you want to know more, even when knowing will break. Youth trees began to hum, not with sound, but with vibration. A low, deep pulsing that echoed through my bones and made my teeth itch. And somewhere behind us, the trail disappeared, not slowly, but all at once, like it had never been there, like it was ashamed to be seen. We set up camp near what looked like the remnants of an old ranger post, a wooden frame, half collapsed and buried in moss, and at the center a rusted badge still pinned to a rotted uniformed sleeve with the name Harlan barely legible. I touched it and felt a jolt like static and saw a flash. Not a memory, not mine, but someone else's. A hallway of trees, a mirror in the woods, my own reflection, smiling with too many teeth. I didn't tell Jared, but he knew something had changed. That night we didn't sleep, not because we weren't tired, but because sleep wasn't allowed. The forest whispered louder, now syllables twisted, familiar names spoken backward and under it all, a voice deep and gurgling like something drowning in mud that said, "Give it back." Dawn. The sky was blood red, The trailhead sign was gone, replaced by a wall of trees, and from the branches above hung more strips of cloth, each one marked with initials. One of them was mine. Jared wanted to leave. I could see it in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, the way his hands shook when he tried to fold the map, which had started to bleed from its creases. The ink ran like veins, black and pulsing, and the paths shifted. Each time he blinked, as if the forest didn't want to be found twice the same way. I told him we'd find another way out, maybe loop around north toward the ridgeline. He didn't respond, just kept staring at something behind me, something I was too afraid to turn and see. We walked for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had started to stretch, then snap, then repeat itself. The same raven passed over us 3 times in the same pattern, wings cutting the silence like knives. Each time it looked more decayed, feathers falling in clumps, until the final pass, when it had no eyes, just holes, just emptiness. And when it screamed, it wasn't a bird's cry, it was a child's wail, sharp and broken and full of betrayal. The trees leaned more aggressively, now pressing in, as if to crush us. The path narrowed into a funnel, roots coiled like intestines, wet and twitching, and beneath our feet the ground pulsed, not metaphorically, not in my head, but physically, breathing like a living thing. And with each step I felt it register my weight. I felt it learning the shape of my tread, the rhythm of my pace, and adjusting for it, preparing for something. We reached a glade at the heart of the hollow, and in the center stood a pine tree, unlike any other, split directly down the center half of it, alive, green, and towering, the other blackened, dead, and seeping from its wounds was a thick red sap that smelled like rotting breath. I stepped closer and saw something nailed to its bark, a photograph, faded but still clear, a picture of me and Jared from when we were children at a family reunion by a lake, smiling but wrong, because we were standing in front of this very tree. It wasn't possible, we had never been here, and yet the photo was dated 2 weeks. Agoja turned and ran. I chased him through underbrush that moved when we didn't, branches that grabbed at our clothes and whispered in our ears, promises, warnings, bargains, and I started to hear names, not mine but close variations of it, as if the forest was trying to get it right, trying to remember what I used to be before I was me. And then I fell. I landed hard in a pit lined with pine needles and bones, the walls slick and breathing. I could hear heartbeats in the soil, not 1, not 2, but hundreds overlapping, and one voice above them all, low and sorrowful and singing a lullaby I hadn't heard since childhood, one my grandmother used to hum in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening, and it made my eyes sting with tears I couldn't explain. Then something crawled out of the wall, not fast, not sudden, but slow, deliberate, tall, with limbs like wet branches bent, backward face hidden by strips of bark that moved like tongues. It reached for me, and I couldn't move, not out of fear, but submission. Something deep inside me said I deserved this, said I had returned what was taken, said I had fulfilled the pact. But Jared pulled me out. He found a stick in the shape of a key and jammed it into the wall. And the pit screamed, not the creature, the pit itself. The ground, the hollowy, ran again, and this time we found something different. A house in the woods, not a cabin, not old, not abandoned, a full two-story. Home glowing with soft yellow light and music playing. From inside we approached cautiously and saw through the windows our family gathered inside, all of them, even the dead ones. My mother stood in the kitchen, humming the same lullaby. My father played cards with Jared's dad, who had died 3 years ago. They all looked at us and smiled, and then their eyes turned black, and then they began to scream in reverse. Jared shattered the window, climbed in. I begged him not to, but he went anyway, and when he did, the house folded in on itself like paper, burned from the inside out, and he was gonna smoke. No fire, no remains, just silence and the trail open again. Waiting, I followed it, because I had nothing else. No map, no Jared, no past stand. The trees parted as I walked, not in welcome, but in hunger. They whispered louder now, not just in words, but in memories. Moments from my life twisted and echoed: my first kiss, my first funeral, my last goodbye. All replayed through mouths that didn't belong to people, faces made of bark and regret. At the edge of the hollow I found a sign carved into a tree. No longer wood, now flesh, bleeding, still warm it. Read: your sorrow is seed, your fear is fruit. Grow with us, and beneath it, my name etched deep. I walked until I couldn't feel my feet, until the pine needles buried themselves into my skin and stayed there, wriggling like they belonged there, like they had always been part of me. And the forest didn't open anymore. It consumed, folding around me with every step, pulling in the air, pulling in the sound, swallowing it like it didn't want anything to escape, not even the echoes of my thoughts. I forgot what direction was. I forgot what sunlight felt like. I forgot my own name, until the forest whispered it back to me through the throat of a tree that pulsed when it spoke. It called me back to the heart of the hollow, where the ground dipped into a wide ring of roots, where the air pulsed like breath, where the pines stood taller and twisted, where the sound of morning was not made by birds or wind, but by the trees themselves singing low, weeping harmonies, like something grieving its own birth and death all at once. And in the center was Jared, or something that used to be Jared. He was still wearing his coat, but it was soaked in bark, his arms outstretched, his hands no longer hands, but branches, his eyes hollow, his voice gone. But I heard him in the roots, in the sap, in the trees. He told me the hollow was a memory, a wound, something old and alive and wrong that had been cut from the world and left here to fester and rot and remember. And it needed people to survive, not to feed on, not to kill, not in the way we understand it, but to where to carry its grief into new generations. Because the mourning pines were not trees but tombs for forgotten names, and every time someone stepped onto the trail, it remembered more of itself. He told me the hollow chooses, and once chosen, you never leave. Not really, you just become part of it. The song guy stepped into the ring, and the roots opened. They didn't tear or break. They parted like lips, like invitation, and I fell not down. But inward I saw flashes of every person who had ever entered the hollow, their lives, their regrets, their screams. Saw the ranger from 96, the one who carved stories into his legs. He was still there, not alive, not dead, just aware. I Saw the woman from the photo, older now, her mouth sewn shut, eyes blinking independently. I saw children with mouths full of pine needles, crying backwards, trying to speak names they had never learned, and then I saw myself not as I was, but as I would become, roots curling up through my spine, eyes replaced with rings of wood, fingers extending like twigs, voice buried in soiland. I understood then that the hollow never ends, it only grows. Each fear, each memory, each grief feeds it, like water feeds roots, and the trees don't lean because of wind. They lean because they are listening, because they are mourning, because they are heavy with the weight of all we left behind. I woke up outside the hollow back at the edge, next to the old sign, but everything was different. There were no birds, no wind, just the sound of weeping pine's eye. Thought maybe I escaped, but when I looked at my hands, they were bleeding sap, and in the mirror of my phone, I did not blink. I went home, but it didn't feel like home. The walls breathed when I wasn't looking. The floorboards whispered at night, and sometimes the reflection in the kitchen windows smiled. When I didn't, he still heard Jared in the roots. When I walk past pine trees, when I sleep, when I cry I've gone back, since I don't know why, maybe to see if I was wrong. But the morning pines are always there, leaning, watching, waiting. The trail always opens when I arrive, not for my feet, but for my grief, because Jacob's hollow doesn't feed on flesh, it feeds on sorrow, and mine never runs out.